to raise your animals, if you're able to raise them at all. It's very important because it also helps to mitigate with the gaps with network distribution, with water distribution, because a lot of our farming is done in more remote areas where you find more fertile soil. But then those tend to be the areas that don't get a lot of connections to the water system. So it's very important to manage, especially in those areas.
Yeah, I totally agree with the points that y'all say because we do face a lot of those water challenges here in Barbados also. Yeah. Next question. What are some of the water challenges experienced by farmers?
I guess we go in the same order, or how do you want to?
You can go in the same order.
All right. Yeah, I think the challenges were more or less mentioned already in a more generic way, if you would put it that way, because individual farmers, I said, access to water remains an issue. And when you talk about agricultural water, I am not convinced that the Caribbean has invested enough in providing water for agricultural districts for that specific purpose. Even domestic supply is still a concern in some of our countries. So individual farmers have to resort to perhaps their own irrigation techniques. They would have to utilize ponds and other sources of water to ensure that they could produce. And as I mentioned before, it remains an ongoing challenge because of the nature of how the agricultural sectors are set up across the region. We don't necessarily have established agricultural districts. If you had something like that, it would be much easier for governments and the state itself to put the infrastructure in place to get water to those specific areas. However, as it stands, you have patches of agricultural districts all over, and that kind of makes it very difficult for infrastructural development to be put in place to support this. So farmers are constantly faced with a battle of trying to get access to water, particularly in the dry season. And as our colleagues would have mentioned, the opposite happens in the rainy season when there is too much and there is flooding, there is loss of crops, etc. And it's an interesting concept because I remember a colleague of mine from another region would have mentioned once, he's from Malaysia, and he said, Malaysia is not running out of water. Water is running out of Malaysia. And it sounds very strange, but what he meant is you have monsoons, and during the monsoons, you have excessive amounts of water. And you have to find a way to understand that you exist in a region where you have seasonal variations. And if you could somehow capture that water and store it and utilize it for when there's not enough, that's one way. And then we also have the whole issue of wastewater reuse, which is becoming very, I guess, popular and less taboo in particularly Trinidad and Jamaica, I would say, through that Crew Plus program, where we are encouraging the use of treated wastewater, particularly for agricultural and landscaping purposes. Some countries have moved towards even developing a standard for that. So that may help going forward. But I think water will continue to be a challenge for individual farmers as we progress, unless we start looking at alternative sources and we find a way to maintain a consistent supply of water to farmers. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to quickly add, in addition to what Ronald said, and I want to just quickly go back to what Ms. West spoke about. She mentioned livestock, and too many times we see agriculture as only crop production, and we pay very little attention to livestock and its critical role it plays in the agriculture in the Caribbean, and also we have the issue of post-harvest handling and agro-processing, which is closely linked to the agriculture and also require substantial amount of water. So we have to bear that in mind, and it leads to what the points I want to make on this whole issue of the challenges, where water scarcity is becoming a challenge now because of we have been experiencing reduced rainfall in the region, and that is closely linked to climate change. We cannot deny that, and the climate impacts we are seeing is not just storms and hurricanes, etc., flood, but we've seen the infrequency or the frequent climate variations across the regions where we know when we were growing up, we know there are two seasons, a dry season and a wet season. I don't think any teacher could confidently teach that now, that there is a dry season and a wet season in the Caribbean, because everything seems to be haywire. So for example, last year we had a very dry, wet season, and now we're going into the dry season. It's coming into March and we're still getting substantial amount of rainfall. So there's a climate variability that is happening. And then I want to touch on the issue of poor water quality. There's too much contamination by land-based sources of pollution affecting our water supply and affecting farms, which oftentimes lead to conflicts between farmers and manufacturers, agro producers, etc. As we've had that issue in Grenada with farmers and the manufacturer, a rum producing facility, where when they discharge, it's major conflicts over destruction of farmers' crops who are using irrigation at the same time. And then, of course, the whole issue of inefficient irrigation systems and inefficient water use in the agricultural sector. That's a major problem. A lot of farmers just turn on their systems and they disappear for the next 3-4 hours. They don't care if a line is broken. They don't care if they're over-irrigating. Major problem. And then the competition amongst different sectors. Oftentimes, if there is a structured irrigation system supplying water to farmers, if the tourism sector needs that water, the farmers will suffer, right? And I think, well, Ronald mentioned the whole issue of salinization with sea line intrusion. But the final thing I want to touch on is the lack of a structured policy, government policy, that speaks specifically to water for irrigation use. We focus on domestic water supply, right? People drink water for health and sanitation, etc. But there is very few organized system in the Caribbean where you can talk about water for agricultural use. And that is because it seems to be a taboo subject that politicians don't want to touch that, because if they touch that and say, well, farmers, you need to begin to start thinking about paying for water for agricultural use, ooh, that may cost you your place in the parliament in the next election. But it's something that we have to begin to address because it's becoming scarce. We have to manage it, and it's not free. There's a cost for water. It has an economic value based on IWRM principles, but it has a social good, and we have to balance that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that I would want to not counter, but give an example of one of the points that Mrs. Thompson just mentioned with respect to the fact that the infrastructure or the legislation is not in place for agriculture. I'll give a positive example of Guyana. We actually do, and Dr. O'Brien mentioned this earlier, we have a cluster of lands used specifically for agriculture. So it's not spread out. Yes, we do have agriculture all over, but in this particular area, it's predominantly agriculture. And we actually have conservancies, dammed areas that were designed specifically for flood management, as well as for providing irrigation waters for our agricultural areas. So there is an example in the region where there is legislation as well that supports this, because the conservancies are managed by a board, as well as a technology or a mechanism that is in place to provide water. And like I said, this helps to manage flood as well across the coast in Guyana.
Okay,
Just to
Ms.
overcome
Webb?
one of those challenges.
Okay.
All right, so
Ms.
everyone
Webb,
touched on it
anything to add?
before. Sorry, say again?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I was saying everyone touched on it before, the access to water. So as we spoke about before, farmers are in some remote areas, so they don't have connection to the network. However, what governments have done, I can speak for Montserrat because I'm representing I live in Montserrat, is that the government has provided subsidized water tanks, heavily subsidized, but the farmers would have to pay for it, as well as they've already brought in some irrigation systems, drip tapes, they've dug dams, they've built sheds for some persons. However, outside of government providing it, I think some of the issues that persons don't know they can access it, or some persons find it cost prohibitive to set up the infrastructure. So there's a heavy reliance on government to help persons to help themselves when it comes to access to water. More can be done to educate persons in the Caribbean about how to manage their own water systems. More can be done to help them to access financing so they can mitigate these issues with water challenges in the Caribbean.
Okay, thank you. You're also free to put any questions or comments in the chat box for the panelists. Y'all touched on this point already when y'all talked about some of the technologies that are being used and that can be implemented to address the challenges that farmers are experiencing, like using the wastewater, treating the wastewater to be used for agricultural purposes and that sort of stuff. But are there any other technologies that y'all would like to zero in on? Dr. Ronalds?
Yes, Kira, I think there are many other things that we could attempt to implement. So for one thing, like something called crop water use efficiency, for instance, right? Crops require different amounts of water at different stages of their development, etc. For the most part, farmers have been, if you ask a farmer, like, how much do you irrigate? When do you irrigate? Like, how do you know when to stop? We have not incorporated technology into our techniques for the most part. Guyana is doing a tremendous job in some regards, as Ms. Franklin would have mentioned before, because there is now this push towards it's no longer 2025 by 2025 because we are in 2025, but they have instituted a lot of initiatives. So what I was about to say is that farmers may just tell you they water based on experience. They may have indigenous knowledge, etc., in terms of the requirements of certain plants, which plants might grow better in less in areas that have restricted amounts of rainfall, etc., right? However, there's AI-driven technology now, soil moisture sensors that can log. You can actually irrigate to the point where you apply the exact amount of water that a plant requires at a particular stage. And that is the whole concept of water use efficiency. Now, to do that, you need to understand the specific requirements. For the most part, we have not done that in the Caribbean to understand the Caribbean varieties of crops and understand the crop water requirements of those Caribbean varieties. You have generic information from other data sets, FAO, etc., that gives you general guidelines, but there is a need to study that and to understand, well, how much tomato needs, how much does lettuce need, etc., at different stages, and have these recommendations out there for farmers so that they could be guided by that. In addition to that, you also have, I think Trevor would have mentioned rainwater harvesting, which many farmers do already. And the other issue is irrigation techniques. So you have, rain guns, etc. And you have more efficient irrigation techniques compared to that, because rain guns will just spray water in areas that is not necessarily accessible by the plants, not directly in the root zone. So you may want to look at drip irrigation, which many farmers do. It's a little more costly and a little more, painstaking to set up, but it definitely uses less water and is way more efficient. We spoke about the wastewater reuse, and in some cases, wastewater reuse may actually be more beneficial to plants because they will have certain amounts of fertility properties in it, nutrients, etc. And then soil moisture conservation in general. Maybe Mr. Thompson would add to this, but things like mulching, no-till, agroforestry, all these things could be added as well. And then, of course, the generic idea of utilizing, or the general idea, I should say, of integrated water resources management, where you look at it from a more holistic approach in terms of allocation of water, the protection of watersheds, ensuring that water is still available to meet the needs of all the different players in this particular realm or area of the world. So that's all I could add at this point in terms of, I guess, technology and techniques.
Oh, sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I said thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, I want to just add just 2 points to what Ronald said, and that is, one is the need to, and I will coin a new term, to to focus on tropical protected agriculture, right? We talk a lot about shade houses and greenhouse, etc. A technology that is imported, but we desperately need to focus on our own indigenous agriculture, because we realize it is becoming a major challenge to adopt some of these technologies from Europe, etc., that is not suitable for us. And then the use of renewable energy on farms. That is extremely important in the times we live in. I mean, we have an abundance of supply. Why do we want to go with fossil fuel pumps when there are pretty reliable solar-powered pumps that could be used? And then the issue of, we need to seriously begin to look at drought-resistant varieties that are adaptable for our region, and do the research into those Caribbean-centric land races. So Ronald touched on it. The final point: land management, proper land management and land preparation. We are coming to realize that that is key towards increasing production, and but also it is important for soil carbon sequestration, which will contribute towards greenhouse gas emissions. So land management, land preparation is extremely important. A lot of farms, it's not done properly. And of course, we could look at tropical protected agriculture, where we kind of redesign how they are done to suit our high humidity, high humidity and sometimes high daytime temperatures. We need to modify the technology to suit our conditions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Franklin.
Can I, Miss Cantleberry?
Yes, please.
Andrew Hutchinson here from Barbados. Can I make a comment, or is it not at this stage for discussion?
Not at this stage, but you could put the comment in the chat box, please.
No, well, I prefer to give my comment not verbally, not in writing. So yeah, go ahead. I'll listen.
Oh, okay. Ms. Franklin?
Most of the technologies that I wanted to discuss, Dr. Rotemar mentioned earlier, so I wouldn't add to it.
Oh, okay. Anything to add, Ms. West?
It's kind of hard coming in last,
We will switch the order next time, right? You and I will have to go first, yeah?
But most of what I had to say was touched already. Spoke about water conservation techniques. Farmers need to use a lot more drip irrigation system. They should really employ a lot more mulching. Even some persons I know use lawn fabrics and weed barrier. So it allows the water to come through, but then it limits evaporation. So all of those are techniques that I know that are being used and can continue being used by more persons.
Okay, thank you. So y'all give examples of how the farmers can better manage their water usage, some of the practices and things that they can implement. But are there anything specific in your countries that, or on your farms, that you have implemented? And we'll start with Ms. West this time.
Okay, so I can speak from experience because I do backyard gardening. So what I did is that I collected barrels, barrels that people ship their personal belongings in, and I assembled them together and connect them. Because of where I was living, I could only accommodate small barrels and I couldn't accommodate a big tank. So then I had all of the water coming into one barrel and it just fills over into the other barrels. So that was a harvesting technique that I used to manage and can be really helpful during the drought last year. Yeah, and I know other persons, they use the water tanks as well. So those are examples that I am aware of.
Okay, we also to use those barrels on our farm to collect rainwater. Yeah, so that is a good idea for any small farmer. Ms. Franklin?
Yeah, and I would similarly in Guyana, we would have persons who individually would harvest rainwater for their little gardens and these sorts of things. But on a larger scale, we have, as I mentioned earlier, the conservancies. We have several of them across the coast that provide irrigation waters to our farming lands. So that's one of the primary technologies that we've had for quite a few years, for probably a few centuries. But we are also exploring, our agricultural organization is also exploring different technologies, different crop varieties that are more drought resistant and that can use less water in order for us to be able to ensure that we always have a food supply within the country.
Okay, Mr. Thompson.
I think our colleagues have touched on most of those already. I think the use of water bladders and ponds, you know, on farms, but there is the options presently in use on farms, etc., in the Caribbean, is very limited, and I think part of it is because there isn't much knowledge transfer happening with other regions. And that could be a limiting factor, but because I believe there are a lot more technologies out there that could really improve water use on efficiency on farms. But there isn't I think a lot of exposure, even though there's the internet and all of that. But you know, farmers is a pretty hardy bunch. They want to hear it from another farmer to be convinced. A lot of the times, if a farmer is doing it successfully, they will implement it. And then, of course, accessing the technology is a major challenge for us in the Caribbean. The input taxes are high. A lot of countries I know give concessions on agricultural inputs. The challenge I see happening now is that the laws, the legislation that is granting those concessions, they need to be updated, because when you go to the customs, the guys are saying, well, that's not in the books, you know? And then it's a back and forth with them. And then, of course, sometimes based on the cost of the technology, the ministry may say, we can grant this concession. You need to go to maybe some body that gives concessions for you as more as an industry. And there is a struggle there also in terms of some of them accessing the concessions, the tax concessions to import the product. So I have had encounters with farmers who bring a new technology, and when they go to the port, when they go to clear it from the port, it's a major issue to get the concession, the tax breaks, as it's not in the law and it's not in the books. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Reynolds?
Hi, Kira. I'm last this time, so I think a lot of the things that were said maybe would have been captured by me as well. But I just want to point out, I guess, a few things. We need to start taking agriculture seriously. And that goes from the grassroots all the way up to policy and legislation. For me, a lot of the talk about agriculture has traditionally been lip service. You have to start looking at the sector as something that is important, something that is vital, and provide the support that is necessary. We want to get to a stage where our agricultural sector is significant enough to support some level of contribution, a significant level of contributions to our GDP, with the exception of perhaps Guyana, Belize, and maybe Haiti. You know, agriculture plays a very limited role in the GDP of many Caribbean islands. Guyana has done that. Conservancy is an excellent initiative that is doing pretty well, but other countries need to follow suit and start putting policy, legislation, infrastructure, etc. in place to support the development of the sector. I do not believe in simply providing some concessions and some incentives and that sort of thing. The sector needs to be more formalized, if you ask me, and if it's more formalized and supported through policy and legislation, there could be some significant headway going forward. The whole issue of, drip irrigation, wastewater reuse, even desal plants in some countries that supply agricultural districts, all of these things are being done. But we need to really get to a point where the sector is more formalized. There are a couple of examples. Many countries have started to utilize the drip irrigation, as was mentioned. There's the Jamaica's Rural Water Program, I think, that has done tremendous work. I think there's an example called Jacob Ladder, where just simply providing water in a underserved community that is based on persons with social challenges, etc., and physical challenges, has transformed the whole landscape of that village to ensure that these people are actually making significant contributions to society and also being able to sustain their own livelihoods. You have other, like countries. Sorry, that was you, Kira?
No, please.
Yeah, right. So
Somebody
yeah.
else has their mic on.
Okay, so continuing from there, you have these investments in both drought and flood resistant strains, because when we take out water management, we have to consider the fact that most of the agriculture, at least in some of the larger Caribbean islands, take place in the flatter areas. So flooding will always be a problem given the whole issue of climate change, climate variability, and climate extremes. And as Trevor mentioned earlier, there is no longer this distinct difference between the wet and dry season as we used to know maybe 30, 40 years ago. There's the potential for flooding even during the dry season. And then you also have things that are more, I guess, in the context of IWRM, where you look at nature-based solutions, so like restoring your mangroves and wetland to improve water in filtration to help with the quality and so on and reduce flood risk. I think Guyana, maybe Angela could add to this, they have like hydrological zoning that protects critical water sources from deforestation and agricultural expansion, because while we promote agriculture, agriculture is also technically a form of land degradation if you look at it that way. So you have to do it properly, and you have to ensure that you don't contribute to the problems that will eventually impact you as well in terms of fertilizer, pollution, etc. And yeah, I think that's all I could think about at this point. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done to improve this aspect of water management in agriculture. Thanks.
Okay, so now we look at things like what is the importance of integrated water resources management in agriculture? And we'll start with Ms. Franklin this time.
Thank you, Kira. So outside the principles of IWRM, specifically when it comes to agriculture, I think the primary ones are promoting sustainable water use, being able to balance our competing demands for water, because as much as water and agriculture go hand in hand, they can become competitors at some point in time, especially for water use in different sectors. I think that the IWRM principles also contribute towards the protection of water quality when it comes to agriculture, ensuring that we minimize pollution that can come from agricultural activities into our waterways and our water sources, as well as helping us to be able to adapt to climate change and ensuring that we are, for example, implementing practices that limit the impact of climate change on our agricultural processes, whether we're using drought-resistant species or varieties, whether we're doing more flood management, whether we are doing more drip irrigation, these sorts of practices that can help to guard us against the impacts. The importance of IWRM is high for me when it comes to agriculture, because it just simply helps us to be able to sustain, just to be able to survive.
Okay, Mr. Thompson, you have anything to add?
I think it's important for us to really go back to the drawing board and clearly define what IWRM is to us, right? It is that we have to understand that different uses of water are interdependent. The construction sector, tourism, education, health, agriculture, we all depend on that same resource. And therefore, we have to understand that we can't manage it in what I would call in silos. The water supply,
I'm all right.
Excuse me, sorry, excuse me.
No, let me make
Butters.
Butters.
Mute her.
Give me a
What am I
second,
doing?
let me mute her.
No, you ain't want to get.
Sorry about that, presenters.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have to understand that efficient use in the agricultural sector is extremely important. We must pay attention to that. We cannot allow farmers, etc., to just have the concept that water is free because I'm pumping from a stream or a river, and I could just use an abundant amount as I want, because there are challenges that are going to be faced. And then the need that we must all have sustainable practices in our homes, right? On the farm. Conflict is a major issue. And it's, we have had in Greater Way, one farmer's fought over a supply and one farmer lost his hand. So that's the reality, especially in where there is other variability. And he's thinking about survival, his family. He has to pay his mortgage. He has to send his kids to school. Conflict reduction is a major issue. And we have instances where communities where water is abstracted for domestic supply are complaining that they are neglected, and the towns, the tourism sector, etc., the hotels are supplied first before they are supplied when there is a scarcity. We have to manage those kinds of things. And how can we improve productivity? We must the thing is, when we were growing up, when I was growing up, as people who practice rainwater harvesting was seen as the poor people. Well, the poor, the marginalized, etc. No, rainwater harvesting is a must. You want to live on a hill overlooking the sea, you have to think about getting some storage. Otherwise, you will suffer some lack of water for health and sanitation in your mansion. So we have to understand that the whole issue of improved productivity must capture all of the resource and not just focus on from the springs and the streams. And we have to look at the issue of environmental protection. Sometimes we do some things with abstraction of water that leaves downstream users and the fishes and the other aquatic life in the streams in dire straits. That cannot continue anymore. Every sector has a role to play and must benefit from that resource. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. West?
Basically what they were saying earlier about the importance of competing priorities. Because I know in some places water is scarce, so it's a matter of balancing what do you give to the farmers or what other persons would get. So.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Ronald?
Yes, for me, I think most of the key points of IWRM have already been discussed. But in order for this to be action, I think some people here may be aware that there's a regional framework for the implementation of IWRM that was done in collaboration with OECS, GWPC, and GIZ, a couple other agencies. And as well, there's also a regional strategic action plan that was done by CWWA a couple of years ago that sort of guides how you would want to implement IWRM in the region. Now, these documents are good guiding documents. However, to get these things really implemented, even if you have the finance and so on, to really have true IWRM, you need behavioral change in the region. By that, I mean, we refer to water as a resource. People do not treat it as a resource. Until we start understanding the value of water, where persons will simply ensure that they fix all leaks in their homes, etc., understand that polluting has long-term impacts on the entire society. And when we change our behavior, that transformative change, perhaps with the younger persons, because some of us, the generations are very difficult to change. So we recognize that farmers are an aging population as well. And we also have to encourage young people to get involved in agriculture and stop portraying agriculture like hard work in the hot sun with a fork and a tall boots and that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be that way. Agriculture can be very, very technologically advanced. It could be to the point where you have drones fertilizing, you have sensors in a room, and you could monitor and apply water, nutrients, everything by the touch of a button. And if we really want to get to that point, we have to start taking the sector seriously. And we also need to have behavioral change, because we could have as much finance to implement anything that you want, but a lot of these things are hinged on people actually understanding that and practicing what they should to improve the overall use and attitude towards water. Thanks.
Thank you. I totally agree with what you said, especially on the point of changing the mindset about agriculture, because that's the first place that it starts. If we change the mindset of how people think about the sector, it would make the sector better. And you also touched on the point of the impact of like things like pesticides and chemicals and the runoff to not only the water system but the health of people. So what are things that we can do to control this?
You're asking me, or?
Yeah, so we could start with you, Dr. Ronald.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of, a lot of people are going towards organic production now. They are veering away from the use of commercial pesticides and so on. And people are actually marketing their produce as being organic, which holds a higher price than conventional agriculture. Now, the whole reason why people have had to use pesticides and fertilizer is because we did not manage the sector properly in the first place. And climate change, all these other things would impact the fertility of soils, the availability of water, etc. So the same problems that we are trying to solve utilizing fertilizer and pesticides, etc., is going to be exacerbated as climate conditions change going forward, and as we meet challenges with water scarcity and so on as well. So one way to do that is to ensure we have, maybe nature-based solutions in place to assist with that, ensure that we plant the right varieties of crops, improve water use efficiency, and also to understand the proper use of pesticides. So there's this whole pesticide technology and plant quarantine program at the UWI, and we are trying to encourage persons to understand, to read the labels properly. Don't just apply it based on, I guess in indigenous knowledge, which is not a bad thing anyway. I'm saying people usually in the agricultural sector, because of how informal it was, most of their practices are governed by experience rather than, I guess, science and technology. And you need to marry the two, right? Because if we want to advance the sector, we need to ensure that we include data, technology, etc., and science into it. So reading the labels, applying them properly, applying them at certain times, following these standards, because many countries have banned certain pesticides and weedicides, etc., because of the impacts it could have on people. I think SVG is an example of that, because there was significant health hazards as a result of applying certain types of glyphosate, weedicides, etc., on plants. Then farmers, their livelihoods are very important. This is their life. So while we could talk all sorts of things here, they are concerned about putting food on the table for themselves and their families. So we have to find ways to work together with them and support them. You can't simply say, don't use this pesticide. You have to tell them, okay, if you're not using this, perhaps this is a better alternative. And not just that, demonstrate it sometimes so that they believe that it works. Because, I mean, a lot of us here may have been involved in some level of farming, but we do not depend on it as a livelihood. And it has to be, we have to take that into consideration when you're communicating information to farmers, because it's an entirely different thing when you are dependent on the production of your facility and somebody is telling you, don't do this and don't do that. And you know that if I don't do this, maybe some pest will attack my entire crop and then I have nothing to get. So that's just my view on the whole issue. Maybe my colleagues will have some additional insights. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. West.
Right, so what I think that can be done to help with some of the challenges listed before me is if the government, the agriculture department, extension officers do a lot more engagement with these farmers and explain these things, because you have Dr. Rupnarayan mentioned it before that you might have some persons using fertilizers and they're not even reading the labels. So we also have cases of that in our region. So if the extension officers can do a lot more to engage and educate, even have what would you call it? Like demonstration areas. So what we've even done here in Montat is that we've built oh my gosh, sorry. We built a station to demonstrate to the public how to do aquaponics. So persons can come in and see for themselves exactly how it can be done. So it's not just word of mouth. You can see for yourself and you can be more encouraged or enthused to implement these practices as well. So if you could have a lot more outreach with the farmers, that would really be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, I listened to my other colleagues and Ronald, and I disagree to an extent with Ronald on this whole issue of acts of banning pesticides, etc. Because from my observation, the impact is very little because there is too much rebranding of dangerous chemicals being practiced in the region. And that is a major, major issue, right? The customs and the port has to be strengthened and educated, their capacity built to identify and to stop these chemicals coming in at the port. Because when they say they ban this and they show a specific label, the manufacturer just relabels it and gives us a nice, sexy name. And those guys sometimes are not aware. So that is something that we must address. The issue of the impact of this on our health. Every one of us have had some farmer in our legacy, in our heritage. And we know how these things impact on genes. So the upsurge in certain kind of cancers in the Caribbean, we understand now that it's heavily linked to the spraying of bananas, etc., that took place maybe 20, 30 years ago. And we've seen a massive upsurge of, we see what has happened in Martinique and Guadeloupe with the banana industry and the impact it has had on the communities across those two territories. So there has to be more stringent legislation to deal with people who are importing these banned substances under new labeling. And I want to emphasize that a lot of the banned substances are coming into the region still and using the agricultural setup with new labels, new branding, sexy name. You wouldn't have think that is Gramaxone. And we have to address it. And I hope CARICOM will address it. Okay, it needs to be addressed. And then we have to look at integrated pest management. That was a big thing in the late 80s, early 90s, but it has fallen by the wayside. That we must look at how to maximize the use of beneficial insects, etc., and even plants, and stop relying solely on chemicals because people want a fast buck. I don't think it's good practice to poison somebody who's coming to buy from you. And we have those things happening where farmers, their conscience are seared in that they would have sprayed a product, and because they see is a fast money, they will still want to. So the education, knowledge awareness, strengthening legislations, educating customs and the port, and of course dealing with rebranding of some of those products has to be addressed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Franklin?
Thank you. I think I support certainly, and I think one of the priority things has to be the policy and regulations across the region as well in ensuring that products are not coming in that are unsafe for us. So definitely would want to reiterate that. Outside of and I'm no farmer, but outside of the standard procedures, and Mr. Thompson just mentioned the integrated pest management, nutrient management, using technologies to help us to be able to do that more efficiently. One of the things, or a couple of things that I think that are also needed, would be, for example, things that we can employ as farmers across the region, buffer strips or constructed wetlands to help protect the environment from the impacts of these pesticides and fertilizers that may be used or may be in the system. I think that educating our people, not just our farmers, but also our people in understanding the impacts that pesticides and fertilizers have is critical as well, so that they understand that when someone says that something is organic, that it may cost them a bit more to be able to produce an organic product. And from an individual perspective, in our small clusters of communities, I think one of the things that we can do is create our own compost. We can individually, we can take our food waste with our local farmers and produce compost so that they have an organic source of fertilizers for their farms. And then in turn, they have a healthier fertilizer to be able to produce a healthier product that we can then buy. This not only helps in that process, but it also reduces how much waste goes to our landfills. It also ensures that we have sustainable practice over time because we're creating that cycle. And yeah, I think that as we as a people have to be educated, and we have to move towards wanting more sustainable practices and more organic products, just to ensure that we minimize that dependency on fertilizers and pesticides.
Okay, thank you. The floor is now open for any questions or comments you may have for the panelists.
You're right, I think Mr. Andrew.
Yeah, it was Mr. Hutchinson. I think that's his name.
Okay. Yes, I'm calling from Barbados, and I decided to listen into your session today. I'm a CWWM member, so I was interested and attracted to the. Of course, you have the Guyanese, the Trinidadians, and all the big farmers there, but Barbados is probably not seen as a big farming destination. But the comments that I heard, particularly some Ronald Roopnaraine, is the fundamental problem is that in most of the, certainly in Barbados and most of the East Caribbean islands, there's a distinctive dry season for 5 months of the year, January through to May. And therefore, it's unreasonable to expect farmers who are going to farm for business to farm all year round when there's no water available for irrigation in those 5 months. And this is a fundamental problem which most governments don't seem to understand. Now, what is the solution? The solution is what I call commercial rainwater harvesting. When I look at Barbados, the amount of rainfall we get is more than we need to irrigate with. Most of our rain falls September, October, November, like 60% of our rain falls in that short time. And it's very possible and practical to harvest rainwater storage to support irrigation during the 5 months, the 5 dry months, right? But the government of the day needs to understand that and invest in horticulture. Barbados imports something like $600 million in horticultural products every year. But we don't seem to understand that we need to boost our situation to attempt to be self-sustaining. We're not going to be totally self-sustaining with the tourism industry. There have been some little steps made. Up at Layers, I designed a pond that actually harvests rainwater, and it holds 25 million gallons. And that is being used to support irrigation for a 77-acre farm lot where there are about 20 farmers leasing the land. And that's a pilot project. It was a public-private sector arrangement where a local entity built the ponds in collaboration with the government. And it seems to work so far, but this is still early days. But the concept, no island in the Caribbean can supply potable water for irrigation used by farmers. Maybe maybe there's an exception. Maybe St. Vincent can do that, but certainly not in Barbados. So if you're going to support farming irrigation, you have to prepare to invest in rainwater harvesting. The water is there. You just need to capture it in a pond and provide the infrastructure to do that. I've done other studies for the Ministry of Agriculture in Barbados, and I've identified 5 areas with big watersheds. You could easily build a pond, build a dam and with a lined pond to hold 30 million, 100 million gallons to irrigate substantial areas of land.
Mr.
So,
Hutchinson, we want to thank you, but our time is coming close
okay.
by.
Yeah. Sorry, I just thought I would just share that with you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the insight. Yeah, so we are coming to the end of our webinar. I would like to thank our panelists and everyone who had questions. Sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions that you have, but we will have another session coming up and we will let you know when that will be. So now we will hand over to the Caribbean Water and Waste Management Association for them to give the closing remarks.
Thank you so much for that, Madam Chair. So again, I would first like to echo your sentiments and thank our esteemed panelists, Tunisia West of ACORI, Dr. Ronald Roopnarine, Deputy Dean and Senior Lecturer at the Faculty of Food and Agriculture, UWI, Angela Franklin, hydrologist at GWI, and of course, Mr. Trevor Thompson, regional consultant and IWRM specialist. Your contributions were quite insightful and have definitely, in my opinion, underscored the need for heightened focus on sustainable water management practices in the Caribbean, particularly as it relates to food and agro-security. You know, focusing on, I heard some lovely and some really great contributions by our panelists from focusing on alternative sources for irrigation, wastewater reuse, and increasing floodwater capture, and of course, the supporting storage systems, shifting the focus from just incorporating water use efficiency at the potable water supply level, but also moving it towards enhanced and efficient irrigation techniques. The agent need to develop appropriate supporting legislation and policies for the agro sector. And of course, finally, support for enhanced access to funding for sustainable agriculture. So I really want to commend our panelists. I would also like to thank, of course, Milagro Matas and the technical team at the Directorate of Economic Integration, Innovation and Development of the CARICOM Secretariat. They were very instrumental in putting this together, and it really was a pleasure working with them to deliver this live panel discussion. I also just want to note the presence of some of our key regional partners. I noticed that we had Mr. Vincent Sweeney, who's the head of the Caribbean Sub-Regional Office at the United Nations Environment Program. I also note that the Dean of the Faculty of Food and Agriculture, Professor Mark Wajivra, is here, is in the audience. And Andrew Hutchinson, who just raised some really interesting questions, is not just a member, but he's a trustee with the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association. And finally, I would really love to thank and offer a heartfelt thanks at that to all of the participants who joined us for this live panel discussion from across the region. I trust that each of you all have gained additional knowledge and can now go forth to serve as national and regional ambassadors advocating for enhanced food and water security in the region. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll hand back over to you, Madam Facilitator.
So I want to thank everyone for coming out today. and wish you the best for the rest of the day.
Everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiraya. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
The
you.
recording,
Have a good
the
day.
recording
Thank
is
you, bye.
available on the
All right, thank
CARICOM
you.
YouTube page and the CARICOM Facebook page. I also believe that the Caribbean Wastewater Management social media outlets will also have the recording if you're interested. Look out for more food for lunch sessions. I think this will definitely lead into part 2 of the water management discussion. And also other sessions in relation to food for lunch. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Enjoy your weekend.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.